So this is a project of the Digital Studies Institute, which is housed in the College of LS&A in Mason Hall. And it's an organization that focuses on the critical study of digital technologies, mostly computing, social media, gaming, but also the history of technology, the study of science and technology more broadly. And we have some really great courses for undergrads and an undergrad minor, which is very easy to get. There's only one required course, which is a lecture course. And there's graduate studies minor, which is also pretty easy to get. So if you've taken any one of our courses, you're probably 2/3 or 4/5 of the way to getting your degree anyway. So that's something you can talk to some of the staff about if it's of interest to you. This project is also supported by the DISCO network. It's a Mellon-funded initiative, stands for Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, Optimism. And we study the race, gender, disability, and the internet. So in some ways, I'm really glad that DISCO doesn't have any of the key words in it that we're not supposed to use anymore, like race or disability or gender. But that is, in fact, what we're doing. So I'm just going to describe the panel a little bit. The panel brings together key voices in infrastructure as broadly imagined, data sovereignty, and decolonial perspectives to critically explore the history, present, and future of the Indigenous Internet. So I don't know if people are aware that Indigenous people have built the internet or that they're very much involved in it at all. But if you're not aware, it's completely not your fault, right? This is a big gap in the history of technology and the way we think about what the internet is and who deserves the credit for it. It's the second in a series of DISCO-sponsored critical conversations about the under-examined contributions of people who make the digital possible and that may point us towards alternatives. This panel will showcase how Indigenous knowledge has and will continue to shape data worlds by bringing together interdisciplinary perspectives on emerging technologies ranging from computer science, artificial intelligence, social media, online activism, and the work of infrastructure and circuit building and beyond. By centering Indigenous voices, the conversation aims to create transformative visions for a sustainable, equitable, and inclusive digital future, while inviting speculative thinking about a post-settler digital world. So I think in many cases, people associate Indigenous people with the past and not with the future or with the present, actually. So our panel wants to really kind of diverge from that by inviting these panelists to speculate a little bit about where they think this technology can go if guided by a different vision from the kind of vision that informs big tech today. So we know that the big seven, the Magnificent Seven they're called, the tech firms basically, are not really trying to help us, right? I think that wasn't really clear 15 years ago, but it's very clear now. There is a way of thinking about technology as something which is to be owned privately and to be developed privately, and then to be held very closely by individuals like Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos. However, there are other ways of thinking about it that we may not have been able to see because we are looking through a very Western settler colonial perspective. At least some of us are, but not all of us are. So hence the work of the people we have here today. This is the good part. So I'm going to talk about the panelists today. Ashley Cordes, KōKwel, is an assistant professor of Indigenous media in ENVS and data science at the University of Oregon and a recent American Council of Learned Societies fellow. Her research lies at the intersection of Indigenous science and technology studies, digital media, and environment place-based studies. She is interested in how Indigenous culture and technology produces leverage discourse, technological and media forms of digital indigeneity towards tribal economic independence, representational and data sovereignty, indigenous cultural revitalization, and the resurgence of indigenous knowledge systems. Her research in AI has been published in the Indigenous Protocols Artificial Intelligence position paper. I've taught this, it's amazing. And her other works on representation, digital humanities, and indigenous methods have been published in journals like Cultural Studies, Critical Methodologies, Journal of International and Intercultural Communication, and Feminist Media Studies. And she is the author of the new book, Indigenous Currencies, Leaving Some for the Rest in the Digital Age, from MIT Press, which I will invite her to talk about. Our other panelist is Majerle Lister, a Diné student whose research interest ranges from indigenous geography, Native American studies, and critical agrarian studies. Focusing on land regimes in the Navajo Nation, he is interested in how land relations are shaped by development projects and historical Diné land relations and practices. His research explores the developmental discourses and practices within the former Bennett Freeze area in Western Navajo Nation. And I'm the moderator. My name is Lisa Nakamura, and I'm professor in the Department of American Culture and a former director of the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan. And I've written books on race, gender, and digital media, including video games and social media. And I have a book coming out in 2025 from University of Michigan. So I'm going to just start with the first question, which is, can you say a bit about how your own area of expertise and research informs the ways that you approach indigenous peoples, building of infrastructure, and how they have worked to maintain sovereignty over it? And can you think of specific examples when people were able to maintain their sovereignty, and some examples where it wasn't possible, and what factors do you think were involved? So I'm going to sit down next to you now.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Majerle. I'm Topan Nanasteja Nishlink, Lizakane Bashas Chin, Kinley Chini Dishache, Hanuyatni Dishanele. Those are my clans. Yeah, as mentioned before, my research is a lot about development discourse and land regimes and how those things impact native land practices. And so for me, the question of infrastructure and sovereignty emerge specifically when Diné people talk about infrastructure. It becomes a site of land struggle. And this emerges because there's a land regime that distributes certain Diné people with the ability to approve or reject infrastructure that people might need for their homes, like water and electricity. And so in a community like that, you have people who do need infrastructure, but then you have people who have the power to deny that. And so infrastructure emerges as a site of land struggle. On top of that, it also becomes a question of sovereignty, because this land regime that kind of dictates who gets infrastructure and who has the ability to deny it or approve it was imposed in the 1930s. And it's something that Diné people and their governments kind of have to navigate, reform, and negotiate with to meet the needs of their people. And so that's how I approach infrastructure. It's more of something that I try to pull out in my research, or I'm trying to pull out in my research from the daily experiences of Diné people, as well as trying to understand the way that they interpret infrastructure. And it's usually a longer project of, as what I'm coining, Diné continuity. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. I'm Ashley Cordes. I'm really excited to be here. When I think of infrastructure, of course, everything always begins and ends with the land. So we are all energized and have animation through the land. And when we think about infrastructure today, I think what gets hidden is the land, right? So the pathways that it takes to have things like the telegraph, like Hirondelle, for example, talks about how the same pathways that animals took millennia ago are the same pathways that were wired for the telegraph and then the internet. But if we think about land more broadly, things like the river, those were networked communication systems that brought indigenous peoples together for the communication and exchange of ideas. If you think of older types of media like dentalium or shell currency, for example, those were ways for indigenous communities to express in-group values, to build notions of trust and reciprocity. And then later, as settler colonialism came and did its kind of thing, we've seen indigenous peoples' ways of knowing be undermined here. So I think what we want to tease out in the conversations today is that indigenous peoples have been innovating technologies for millennia. And we have even many stories of this. One that I share is of animals, for example, of Coyote, for example, who brought in the technology of fire, and Coyote gave it to one animal, and then the animal gave it to Rabbit, and then Rabbit gave it to Lamprey, who's been around for millions and millions of years. And for any technology or any infrastructure to exist, you need tons and tons of people to do it over time. So to think that infrastructure is an invention of Silicon Valley, for example, would be a gross erasure of the many different materials and peoples and non-humans that need to come together for anything to be successful.
Thank you. So, Ashley, you have a new book from MIT Press. Can you tell us about why you wrote it, what your main argument is, and what it has to say about digital indigeneity?
Definitely. So you started by kind of mentioning how there is still somehow this problematic discourse that indigenous people are technologically backwards, despite so many years of us proving otherwise. So that was kind of the impetus of me writing this book, is that people tend to believe that things like cryptocurrency, for example, are a settler invention. But again, it took millennia to build all of the technologies that are required in order for cryptocurrency to exist. So in my book, I talk about cryptocurrency as the compression and convergence of indigenous knowledges over time. How, for example, indigenous technologies like a wampum belt, which is beaded ledger systems, or indigenous necklaces, for example, how those were really setting the stage for pre-digital, and you talk about this in your amazing article, Lisa. So what I really want to draw out is things like polymorphism. So indigenous currency, for example, or indigenous media is always more than just one thing. So a necklace, for example, could be something that you wear to show your in-group values and to show wealth, but it's also so many other things like contractual obligations and contracts between tribes and relationships. And so cryptocurrency or blockchain, for example, has become something that's polymorphic, right? So it's something that is a record-keeping tool, but it's also so many other things. Have you seen things like art and NFTs kind of built and baked into the system? So what I'm really trying to do is kind of excavate the ancestors that live in all of the technologies that we see today. And in the book, I kind of take a deep dive into both the gold rush and the code rush, because I think that there are so many parallels in terms of resource dispossession and how indigenous peoples have been pushed from their lands or had their sovereignty taken away in what was the gold rush of the 1850s. And now looking at present day, how we're looking at things like bandwidth and server space and land that's now being encroached upon for data centers from the US government, for example. So we need to take a really critical look, right? So just because indigenous people have set the groundwork for creating all of these technologies doesn't mean that settlers can't let it percolate in fraught directions. And within a capitalist system, you're always going to see that happen.
Thank you. Okay. Please feel free to respond to each other as we're going, because it can be more free-flowing. So, Marley, you and Ashley both research indigenous geography and development discourses. How does place influence the way that you conduct your research? And can you talk more about what you do as a researcher and the ways that you do it and your goals?
Yeah, no, place is a very geographic concept. It's kind of the first things you learn when you go into a geography department. And I've spent many times thinking about how these geographic concepts kind of emerge in my own research. And I think the way I see it is like placemaking. Settler colonialism is a very imposed placemaking, whereas Native people for years have been having years of living in the land and kind of developing a relationship and a belonging to the land. And for me, in my research, a lot of that comes out in the research of, looking back, I think more recently I was able to get a hold of some land management papers from the 1930s for my community where I'm conducting my field work. And what I thought was most surprising was that a lot of my community members recognized the names of the people who participated as laborers for the Civilian Corporation Corp, the CCC, if you're not familiar with the lingo, as well as the people that they surveyed for the soil, like asking how many sheep do you have? And again, I should probably add some context to this period. It's right in the 1930s, the early 30s, so it's right before the Navajo livestock reduction occurred, when the Navajo Nation and the federal government killed off livestock in the name of like protecting the soil for various reasons. So there was this imposed forced livestock reduction, but the research the papers that I had found were prior to that, and that you can read and see in the actual these papers that they're already kind of thinking about doing this livestock reduction, like hinting at it. But at the other half, you see like my family members' names on there, people I've grown up listening to, people I've heard stories about. And I think when I presented these papers to my community, it invoked a lot of memories, and it invoked memories about their families talking to CCC workers, as well as occasionally, sometimes little scant memories of when these people would come to their homes and ask them. In other cases, it talked about their first time when their relatives were entering into the wage economy, where they started to see an income in the form of cash rather than the traditional subsistence practice of like livestock and farming that was kind of dominant at the time. But income and cash was starting to kind of creep in more and become more of their daily experiences. And so that sense of belonging that kind of occurred through there was something that they had kind of developed over the years. And then they were also looking at these maps that had these kind of, I guess for lack of a better term, foreign words. And then they would point them out and tell me the actual traditional place names and tell me why they were named after that. So that was the really nice thing about that, is seeing these old maps, but also seeing, in some ways, the community members repopulate that map that was very abstract and pretty much scant of detail, but with indigenous place names. And a lot of those place names come from stories, localized stories, and they were also from family stories too, from the more recent history of like the Long Walk, when Diné people were forcefully relocated and had to return back to their home in the 19th century. And so to me, that's kind of how placemaking, the sense of place, and this idea of like belonging or indigeneity, to me, indigeneity is both a political project, something that is an outcome of the settler colonial project, as well as a process, a relationship to the land that emerges through various practices. And I think I might be generalizing here, but I would say like with Navajos, a lot of the times it's livestock. It's a very deep connection to the livestock that we herded, as well as farming as well. And then the way we craft and tell our our cosmologies around these areas. So that was kind of the first thing that really started to come to mind with like the idea of like placemaking and belonging and indigeneity, is specifically in this community, because each community is different. Each community has their own landscape, their own geographical formation, and then as far as I can tell, they kind of crafted into this larger way of understanding the traditional Diné cosmology. So yeah, and it's coming through interviews and focus groups that I find best, because if you're just looking at documents from the 1930s, it is absent of any of this, except for maybe just people's names. So yeah.
I think that you're picking up on something really important. So place-based methods are absolutely critical to Indigenous studies, but Indigenous people who are situated in adjacent fields like media studies also really recognize this. So a lot of the times the big question is, how does one study digital or cyberspace, which is meant to kind of be this kind of spaceless place, when really it is really rooted in space. So for example, if I'm studying something like a cryptocurrency, I'm studying one called Mazacoin, which was created for the Oglala Lakota Nation in what is now known as South Dakota. It's definitely a currency that exists in cyberspace or networked computer space, but it's also very place-based. So I think it's really important to also use those kind of human methodologies and do the work to show up to the nation, to go through their IRB processes, to interview people, to ask if the coin is actually being used there, to understand the coding parameters and how, or if it is even serving the communities that it says it's going to. So oftentimes when people study infrastructure or digitality, they think that they're off the hook from the human element or having to go in person to study things. But what I've been saying this morning and always is, you can't talk to people and not learn something, and you can't sit in a place and not learn something. So I think it's really important to ground yourself in the space that you're working in, depending on what you're actually studying. But I think it's a really key element of making sure that you're studying things in the holistic way that Indigenous media and infrastructural studies requires.
Thank you so much for those answers. That's really useful to have as context. The Diné are said to be the most studied people in the world and have many reasons to not want researchers taking up their time and energy. But at the same time, they have been at the center of computing's history. This is how I connected with Majerle, actually, as I was studying the work of Indigenous women living in the Shiprock Reservation, Navajo land, who worked as factory workers for the Fairchild Semiconductor Corporation from 1965 to 1975. Fairchild was the largest employer of Indigenous people during that time period after the federal government. And this plant sprang up quickly because these things were built to suit the needs of engineers who were trying to push out marketable products like calculators and transistor radios, and in this case, aerospace, because it was the defense industry. And you could only manufacture weapons in the US. So everything else was getting outsourced to Asia, where it was cheaper. The only place cheaper than Asia, or as cheap as Asia in the US, were Indigenous people's lands, because the minimum wage did not apply there in the same way. And I think this story is not really known when people pick up a game console or even a phone. Who made those chips? Who was the person who put their labor into that? It's going to be a woman of color almost all the time. Now an Asian, but it used to be Navajo people. So they're both at the center of computing's history as hidden creators and as cryptographic resources that could work more efficiently with data than a computer. And by that, I'm speaking specifically to the story of the Navajo code talkers, who, if you're familiar at all, were used during World War II as kind of human Enigma machines in order to get information across German lines, because German people just could not understand Navajo language at all. They could break a code, but they did not understand what Navajo people were saying. So Navajo have been represented as more intelligent than artificial intelligence of that period. At the same time, as creators of some of the most advanced semiconductor components, yet also, in some ways, stuck in time. Right? Not seen as modern in the way they deserve to be seen. Can either of you give any practical advice for non-Indigenous and Indigenous researchers about how to approach this hidden history of technology in Indigenous land? And what has that process been like for you during your own research?
Sure. So I really like the theory of the cyborg by La Paperson. If you're not familiar with it, it's talking about how even as people that are embedded within colonial systems like universities who do research on topics like this, how can you actually make the most of it and do decolonial work and kind of excavate those hidden histories that are very purposefully hidden? So it's all about going into the machinery and rewiring it and trying to pull out those important things. So in many ways, it's always the most easy argumentative kind of path to say that something is colonial. So we want to say the telephone phone is colonial, a university is colonial, language is colonial. Yeah, that's true, but we're also using all of those things for many decolonial aims. So we need to use the researcher tools that we have at hand. We're not throwing away the baby with the bathwater here, to make sure that we're excavating and looking through all the different parts of the machinery to see which parts of it are indigenous and to see which parts of it are problematic, because we can't continue to see technology as something that serves settler colonialism from the ground up. And if that means that we go into the technology and we find out that the people and the histories are problematic, then we need to go in and rebuild that system. And that's what a lot of indigenous AI researchers and blockchain researchers are doing now, right? How can we have indigenous programming languages? How can we lift up these really amazing people like Holly Grimm, for example, who are doing work in this kind of cutout, unfortunately. But how can we lift those voices up and excavate the stories so that way we're telling a more complete history?
Yeah, no, everything you said, I echo. For me, it's kind of born out of a pragmatic podcasting. But the best way I could do that and have a great podcast was to go in with as much information as I could, but also checking my assumptions. And just because I perceive something to be colonial or decolonial, I shouldn't go into a conversation with someone I'm interviewing and assume they think the same thing. And that emerged continuously in my earlier research on the Navajo Nation at Diné Policy Institute, which is when we were doing a land reform report. I couldn't just go in using the language of like an agrarian Marxist and being like, how much did you work today? You know, how much bushels of hay? You know, or like, are you a proletarian? You know, these things don't really have any meaning to them. And so for me, I really had to check my assumptions about, well, do they think of the land regime as capitalist or colonial? I just kind of kept it in the background and just asked them how they felt about it. And you know, I think it takes practice to go into even your own community and to check your assumptions about what kind of data you're going to get from it. And that was the biggest lesson I learned. And because of that, I was able to really grapple with the data and in some ways kind of build upon the current theory. Because that's what you usually do with empirical data, is you try to expand or generalize from it to kind of add to the theory that has been put before. And so for me, that was something I learned at a very early time in research, which is to check my assumptions, but also just try not to go in there with heavy jargon. And this is, like I said, this is from my own community. I assume that if they saw me and if I spoke Navajo, they would just be willing to talk to me. But that term over-research, I think, is that the exhaustion that comes from that is very real, because some people would just hear the whole introduction and they would close the door on us and be like, I'm not interested. Or in some cases, they would elaborate and be like, we've had people like you come in here before. And I would jokingly be like, were they Navajo, though? You know, and they would be like, yeah, and then they would still close the door. And so I learned, on top, I guess it's something we've also talked about beforehand, which is we'll really emphasize that the data that we collect from here will be presented and distributed at their local government, and that they will see the end results of this, which is something that had never, as far as I could tell, and from my experiences, they had never actually been able to have access to. It's usually people coming to conclusions and never delivering any of the results to them. And so for us, that's what I did, is I presented to the local government our findings, and you know, it was really nice. It was satisfying because they were very thoughtful and they were very thankful that we had done this. I think it was like an hour and a half from our work. So it was a tremendous drive here to and fro. But I think that was something I learned, to really emphasize that the data that we're collecting will be returned to them and presented to them. So from like that point on, we released and published, we printed anything we published and left it at the chapter house and told them like, hey, if anybody wants to see this paper, they can. And if you need someone to present on this paper, you know, let us know. And that's something, even as a researcher, that's something I'm really interested in doing, leaving my finalized dissertation at my community where I'm going to be doing my field work, but also providing any opportunity to talk about it. Because researchers, I think, we love talking about our work. So if we can share that with the people that we did the research on, or with, I should say, that's even better. So Yeah, and I think part of that process is really just checking your own assumptions when you go into these communities, with no matter how much theory you've read.
Yeah, I think done are the days where you go into indigenous communities like anthropologists did in the 1700s and 1800s and extracted, researched, and preserved them and thought that indigenous people were somehow vanishing, right? Very much gone are those days. Now indigenous nations are oftentimes very particular about who they work with. They want to see that you're interested in working with the nation for the long run, that you have an actual education. I mean, people start with negative 100 knowledge on indigenous peoples. So peoples who are coming just straight to the nation and saying, I'm going to do this work and I'm going to do this, are going to see the door, right? You need to be sure that you're understanding the deep history and sitting with the land and sitting with the people and knowing that doing a research project with indigenous nations often means that you're committing to a very long-term relationship with them. So you really need to understand what you're getting into, but also understanding that it is really rewarding and that the benefits of it are really important. Definitely for the indigenous people if you're working with them correctly and compensating and enabling kind of reciprocal practices, but also making sure that you're using the protocols that they've set in place. Is it important for you to give gifts? We do give a lot of, it's a stereotype, but we do like to give a lot of gifts to one another to maintain different types of relationships, because those become currents that keep our relationships intact and show that we're coming in with a good heart and with good care. And returning that data also becomes a type of gift in and of itself, because it leads to generations and generations of people who can know themselves better, right? And the more we know about ourselves and the more we know about land and we know more about objects as object-oriented peoples is really critical.
I would just like to add, gift cards, compensating those you interview. I think, that was the big thing with us, is we were trying to figure out what we should gift the people that we interviewed, and we, due to like the complex experiences that they have, we just settled maybe a gift card will be fine. But yeah, I think definitely monetary compensation for anybody you're interviewing. Food really helps too. I mean, it gets the conversation going, so yeah.
Yeah, my brief experience doing some field work when I went to the Shiprock Chapter House was I got there early because I didn't really know when it was supposed to start. And so someone showed up and began setting up chairs for the meeting. And there was a lot of people coming to that meeting. So I set up chairs for 20 minutes. And I don't think I would have been able to do any interviews if I hadn't done that, because it kind of shows that you are in some way aware that you're asking for labor from people. And if you're willing to give some labor back in the form of cleaning or in the form of getting things ready, or whatever needs to be done, like if you see trash on the floor, throw it away. Like, just be a kind of conscientious person. Surprisingly, that makes a big difference, I've found. Not that it wouldn't other places, but it did seem to help for me. So I'm going to kind of go off the script a little bit and ask you a question about a recent development around the manufacturing of chips. So the CHIPS Act, which was something that was supposed to revitalize electronics manufacture in the US, was meant to give a huge amount of money to different states to build semiconductor manufacturing plants, because those are all overseas right now, and they're very, very, very expensive to build. And that did not really happen. And with the new administration, the new president really wants us to become a manufacturing country again. So to bring back those jobs where people are standing in factories, or looking into microscopes or in clean rooms, making very, very small objects. So when I went back to do interviews at the Shiprock chapter, one of the most interesting questions people asked me was, is the plant coming back? And I think they were wondering, maybe because no one had been there to talk to them about it in a really long time. And also because as a Japanese person, they kind of knew that's where all the work had gone. So I had to tell them, no, that plant isn't coming back. And surprisingly, people were somewhat disappointed, because it had been a good way to keep young people in the community and having to leave. So the US government gave a ton of support to the Navajo Nation to build that plant. They were only able to lease the land, but they required a lot from the Navajo as well, which was to build and maintain that property, which was very, very expensive. So I'm wondering what you think about the idea of reservations or other indigenous lands as being devoted to those purposes again? Like, what do you think would happen if that plant hadn't closed? And we can talk more about why it closed, but what if it had kept on going? Would that have been something that you think would have been more productive for the people living there, or is it good that it closed down?
No, that's a great question. I think of that specifically. I really couldn't guess what it would be like. I mean, I think for sure it would have provided some jobs, the same way that coal mining in the Navajo Nation has provided some very robust wages that supported a lot of families, which is why some people, coal workers, were really supportive of it. And they saw it as a good means of taking care of their family. And they even started to rationalize it in a Navajo way with a certain phrase. And so I think the same thing would have happened with Shiprock. It would have provided, a group of people with a lot of wage. And, the thing about Shiprock is it's one of the few places on the Navajo Nation where a lot of different development projects have happened, like more recently crypto mining, but it's gone through like agriculture, it's gone through like commercialization, it's gone through microchip, so all of these different types of development have actually been practiced here. And so I think the one thing that sticks is just farming, because a lot of people are farmers. But I would have to, if I had to guess, I'd say it would have provided, a good income for a lot of families, and it probably would have invoked a response of like people supporting it. But I'm actually not surprised by the fact that people were still asking, because I think some people still have that experience with coal mining. It's like, is coal coming back? And I think more recently, the Navajo Nation, Boo Nygren, he, took a picture, met with Trump at this one of these meetings, and was, made a memo that the Navajo Nation would work with his administration to become a leader both in energy production as well as coal. And that sparked a lot of conversation about, one, his leadership, but also the direction of the Navajo economy if coal could come back. And so that type of relationship, that type of labor, I could see with like microchips of people having that relationship with that. And I don't necessarily know. Yeah, I think it would make Shiprock that much more unique. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that sovereignty, or like the inherent as well as government to government relationships that tribal nations have, like sovereignty ultimately means that each nation gets to decide for themselves what decision, whether that's economic or religious or educational, what decisions are best for them. So one nation might decide that they want a semiconductor plant, others might not. When you're talking about the CHIP Act, I'm fearful that the next administration is going to leverage, instead of offering opportunities for economic development to indigenous nations, they might try to, unfortunately, leverage lands that they already have, which could take the form of national labs or national parks, for example, to build things like data centers and semiconductor plants. So that's my kind of fear here. And we also really need to think about the environmental impact of all of these places, right? Over 60 minerals and fossil fuels are required for certain types of technologies to exist today. A lot of water is required for things like data centers to be cooled down. A lot of times when some of these centers are brought into places, they don't necessarily hire people from there. Shiprock was a great and unique example. And that's because indigenous people, especially when it's on their own nation, can have the rights to kind of shape things into what they want them to become. So we'll kind of see as the future kind of unfolds what ends up happening. But curious as to more internal production happens, where and how that's going to happen, and what the environmental and economic impacts are going to be of that.
Can I? Yeah, I would like to. Environment, yeah. For Shiprock, that was one of the biggest things. Was in 2015 there was a Gold King mine spill, which a lot of contaminants were released, or I guess, were contaminated the river that's next to Shiprock, the San Juan River, and that threw off a lot of the like agricultural economy in that area as to whether or not it's even viable, because they're like, what if our corn is infected? What if our livestock is infected? And then that kind of prompted discussions about what kind of economy can we have? And some people talked about like microchips, like remember that? And so it does, the idea of what could be done on lands is definitely inherent a question of what you said, sovereignty, but there's also like these other factors at play that kind of shape the discourse around development itself, as well as what sovereignty entails.
Great. So I'm going to ask you a kind of impossible question, which is how you think some of the words of wisdom that you've given us might relate to building sustainable and equitable and inclusive digital futures, because the digital doesn't look so great right now. It's kind of in a bad way. It has not turned out to be the utopia people thought it was going to be on many levels. So what would a post-settler digital world look like to you, and what do you think needs to be in place for that to happen?
I think Michel Foucault talked about utopias or places that are fundamentally unreal, right? So we really need to think about what we're trying to build and who we're trying to serve with it. So I think that the best chance that we have are to look at these indigenous epistemologies, indigenous feminisms, indigenous care of land, indigenous animation of technology, for example, and have indigenous software producers. We need indigenous humanities scholars. We need all different indigenous people to come together and try to build systems that serve indigenous peoples and the non-human world in different ways. So I'm very just pro getting indigenous people involved to the best of our abilities to try to make things better before it's too late. And I do think, like the cyborg theory, we have the opportunity to kind of come in and rewire and rethink the way that we're doing digital to build more livable futures to come. And I'd really like to see the next generation of indigenous peoples kind of come together to do that work.
So I've seen Terminator. No, I'm just kidding. No, I agree. I think for me, I approach that question the same way I would approach settler colonialism, which is it's a project that requires not just natives to undo. It's something that requires intense collaboration and cooperation that takes a long time. It's a multi-generational thing. And part of that, like you said, is to bring in indigenous people as well as epistemologies and cosmologies to shape how AI as well as infrastructure could be used. You know, I think in a lot of communities, in a lot of native communities, infrastructure extracts. They usually extract, at least in the Navajo Nation, extracts electricity, coal, water, and it doesn't necessarily benefit the people there. You know, we don't get a portion of the electricity. We do occasionally get sacks of coal to keep our houses warm, which I think if it's Christmas, that can be interpreted as a bad thing. But the idea is that what if we were to have infrastructure for human use that benefits us rather than on profit or private ownership? So I think that's something I think about, at least materially with infrastructures. How could it benefit the community? And I'm saying that from someone who came from a community where we didn't have electricity. I grew up without electricity and running water. So having electricity and water was almost a luxury, but a necessary luxury. You know, so, and I think a lot of native people would agree that if we had infrastructure that benefited them and, was for their use, they would approve a lot of it. I don't think a lot of people, if coal were to be used and for the people for like heating houses in the Navajo Nation, I think it would also be their sovereign act to take it upon themselves and go into that business. But because of its history and its extractive nature, that doesn't happen. So people are less inclined to accept it and they're more resistant to it. So, I think, and that requires a lot of collaboration. Native communities are chronically underfunded, and large infrastructure scales in the Navajo Nation usually come from large rounds of investment from the federal government, and that's like a treaty relationship. It's a sovereign relationship. So, yeah, it's going to be, it's to kind of go on a more hopeful note. There are people doing that, and there are people addressing this idea of data sovereignty, but also trying to shape infrastructure to be more beneficial to its people. So, yeah.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm realizing why the self-driving cars in San Francisco are getting attacked by people all the time. They're not just replacing human labor, but in some ways when people are living in their cars in Silicon Valley or don't have the basic infrastructure, the idea of sending people into space or doing neural implants, which is what, a lot of these larger companies want to do, just seems to be kind of a mockery of what an equitable digital future would be. And particularly, as you're saying, the history of so many of these very things like crypto that are making a bunch of people really rich aren't even their own histories, right? They had their roots in people working with different kinds of currency way before there was the internet at all. So I'm really excited to hear you both have such a longer view of this, because when people talk about any racial group, any ethnic group, and the internet, they basically mean since 1985, pretty much, right? So I'm going to invite you to respond to some of the things that you were also saying, and just to riff off each other and things you were also have not said before. So feel free to just start talking to each other.
I like your points. No, just kidding. Yeah, no, I think I wanted to say something about what you said about the epistemology. I think there's a lot of, like, these stories that, these cosmologies that Native people have are generally, like, characterized as, you know, primitive or pre-modern, you know, usually in the guise of, like, a linear sense of time that development discourse takes, which is, if you start here, you're pre-modern. But there's a lot of knowledge in those stories. You know, it shapes a lot of Navajo cosmology, and it comes from years of having a relationship with the land that these stories emerge out of, and they're in some ways a form of what's the word I'm looking for, like knowledge, I guess. And so I think there's, you know, the way I'm thinking about it is, I think as Deborah Cohen and Winona LaDuke have this idea of talking about extractive infrastructure as like Wendigo infrastructure. It's something that just cannibalizes rather than actually sustaining. And then in that article, they talk about like cherry bushes as a form of like positive infrastructure, and thinking, moving infrastructure beyond simply how we see it of like telephone poles, and think of it as like cherry bushes, like the times when the salmon would go through, looking at the actual subsistence practices of animals and the things that we have relied on longer than capitalism, that will probably exist even after capitalism. And so looking at these and learning how we can reinforce these infrastructures, I think they called it infrastructures of care, and kind of reinforce it. And that also takes on a environmental dynamic of like the sustainability of our current infrastructure, as well as like AI and crypto mining. So you know, things like that, you know, that could only be parsed out through intentionally listening and thinking through with like Native people and their cosmologies and how they're understanding infrastructure that, as I mentioned before, if you're just looking at government documents, are completely absent of.
I like that you just said that capitalism is not very old. When you think about it, even things like the United States, like there are restaurants that in other countries that are older than the United States. Like capitalism is made to feel as if it's something that's very natural, but we have tens of thousands of years of other types of systems that have worked a lot better. And we also have thousands of years of histories of things like wampum belts or hypertextuality, or things like potlatch, which just taught us about distributed ledgers and things like we consider now to be blockchain, that can really teach us a lot of lessons as we kind of move forward here. And I think you're spot on when you're talking about data and data sovereignty and how we need to think about data in different ways. I think it was Michelle Murphy, who's a science and technology studies scholar. She references this picture from Belcourt during the Water is Life campaign, and it was this artist of this pregnant woman who had salmon in her belly, and it was kind of connected to the ground and into space. And it's just like the idea that like water is life, salmon is life, like data is life. Like we are all kind of connected here in really interesting ways. And so I was always saying like, oh, we need to make data sacred again. And then I realized it sounds like too much like Make America Great Again. So I need to think about something else to have as a slogan, but we really need to make data less abstract and more sacred, because the more we start to value and stop atomizing some of these things that are building and being scraped, the better we are going to be at being able to be in relation and to build better machines from the ground up.
Yeah, I love that idea of make data sacred again, because rather than being an inexhaustible resource like supposedly water is, I think people are realizing water is not inexhaustible, and neither is data, right? Everything comes from somewhere, or in this case, someone. So it may have been something someone else was using or was planning to use, or at least had the contract to use. As you were talking, Marley, about new ways of thinking about what we give and what we get back. Reminded me of an experience I had with one of my seed starting news groups. So I'm a gardener and everything. And I saw that there were some, quote, primitive vegetable seeds that have become very popular. And some of these vegetables kind of look like a hunk of old yarn, you know? So you pull it up, it's a hunk of old yarn. And it's a perennial vegetable, meaning you don't have to replant it every year. So you harvest it, you take some of it every year, and then you leave some, and then you come back the next year. Now, I don't know what this stuff tastes like in any way, but it's certainly not things people are eating now. And so that idea that you may have to change your diet somewhat if you want to leave something in terms of either data or spirit or space or any of the things you've been talking about is kind of trickling through into the horticultural group because of preppers. So preppers are very concerned about depletion, you know, and they want to get as much as they can for themselves, which is not really the spirit of what we're talking about. But there is now more interest, I think, in certain kinds of conservation around resources and infrastructure. So I think we have time for questions from the audience if anybody would like to ask one. And we have Zoom questions too.
Hopefully this isn't too off topic, but I have to, this is very what me and Marley talk about, but I'm curious to also hear from you as well, Ashley. So currently we're in sort of, I'm thinking about this stuff internationally is what I'm hoping to get at. Currently we're seeing a realignment on the international stage. We're seeing Europe move towards China. We're seeing all kinds of things in the post-World War II era we wouldn't have imagined happening. We're sort of seeing liberalism in a spiral or in a crisis or whatever you have it. And I'm kind of curious, you know, as we see ourselves in this sort of rapid change, most of us feels quite negative right now, and much of it is. What kind of like opportunities do you see, especially thinking of these things in an international context, and what kind of concerns do you see thinking of these things internationally? And like placing Indian country, Native communities in an international context rather than just as existing within the U.S.
Yeah, no, I was in this economic geography class, and I jokingly, but not jokingly, wish that the Navajo Nation would have their own Belt and Road initiative, you know, just so the Navajo Nation could get some nice railroads that would be dedicated to like moving us around, because it's a pretty large it's a pretty large reservation. But I mean, it's kind of that, like I don't think the US would allow us to, but that's, you know, it's how indigenous nations in the US are hampered by the US government, is we're not necessarily able to flex our full sovereignty and start reaching out to other nations. I mean, I think at one point the Navajo Nation was working with Cuba with seeds and whatnot that I just found out about 2 years ago. I've been trying to like figure out how that went. It just ended. So, or it ended abruptly in like the 2010s. So there is a possibility for Native nations to kind of start going beyond the US. I don't know what that would look like, but it would be very interesting, and kind of having like a solidarity with anything other outside of current Western, dare I say, imperialist countries. I would be really intrigued by that. But at the same time, I think, you know, that's been one of the biggest issues of Native sovereignty in general, is that it's kind of always paternalistic from the U.S. government. But at the same time, I think it might, I don't know, I guess like I said, Boo Nygren, the president, has already shifted and kind of hopping on coal and its redevelopment potentially. But at the same time, I see other people really interested in like agroecology and like really building up like food sovereignty. That's kind of like a big thing right now of like, how do we make our own selves self-reliant so that we don't rely on outside entities to provide food for us, and that we can also trade with other tribal nations within the U.S. different goods. And like, how could we foster those relationships so that we can then leverage our own ability against the U.S.? And some of this is kind of from a history of, is it CERT? The Council of Energy Rich Tribes, Resource Tribes, where like a bunch of Native nations leveraged their reservations because they had oil, and tried to like kind of become an OPEC. And it was led by the Navajo Nation council or chairman at the same, president chairman, oh my goodness, I'm embarrassingly forgetting his name right now, but he's such a great guy. Can't remember. Peter McDonald. And he tried to like do what OPEC did, but with native resources of oil within our communities. It didn't go so far. But yeah, so there's definitely, it is a time of like crisis, but I think a lot of tribes are kind of going in different directions, and I've been very inspired by what some researchers are doing with agroecology and food sovereignty in their communities, and kind of focusing more efforts on sustaining those vital, I guess, infrastructures, if we're going to expand it, caring infrastructures. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we all need to practice more of saying like the multinational United States. Like we don't automatically. A lot of people assume that there are 574 plus indigenous nations within the United States, and we have our sovereignty, but it's also domestic dependent and paternalistic sovereignty, where certain rights are granted and other rights aren't granted. So I think that's why I particularly took on the topic of currency in the book, is because in these type of systems, currency is kind of really what speaks to it, and it shows where there's kind of gaps in sovereignty. So one of the rules is that tribes cannot specifically mint their own currencies, but cryptocurrency became this kind of way for tribes to give a kind of middle finger to the US economy in some ways, because they're able to implement something on a system that is supposedly networked and can draw from different nations' currencies and can have a wider spread. And there's also many nations, like the Catawba Nation, who are creating their own economic zones that are able to issue cryptocurrencies and do auditing and to register corporations from other places like Puerto Rico, for example. So you see indigenous nations being able to assert sovereignty in new ways as currency changes as well. So as you see these kind of changes in technology, of technologies of everyday life, like currency, like those are the spaces where we can kind of flex. And you're speaking of many different areas, like agriculture, for example, education, for example, and these are going to be really important. I think there is this kind of fear now of like, I mean, even the KōKwel Nation, we weren't a federally recognized nation until 1989, and now with new administration, there's this kind of fear that's been going on with citizenship and who gets to be what, and it is really concerning. So everything we can do now is to protect sovereignty, because sovereignty is what we have and it's worth everything.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one bit to that question. I'm not by any means an expert on geopolitics, but it does strike me that each of the major powers you're talking about does itself marginalize its own indigenous people. So people in China who are indigenous, in Russia, in basically every large economic, kind of player has that. And so if there were some way to network every group of people whose resources and land have been taken and bring them together, that would truly be a utopian kind of thing. But there's so many challenges to that, I think. And one of those would be like even provision of service. So I'm not sure that broadband is available everywhere in native lands necessarily, and access to computing, access to telecommunication is not always easy to get either. So it seems that that's got to be part of that conversation about, whose alliance is going to win and how are indigenous people involved. That seems to be one way in which they're involved, as to be the kind of resource target for a lot of different places to then wage their kind of wars with each other. Any other questions? We had a question. You had a question.
This is much closer to the ground.
Yeah.
It seemed like the work of Holly. Oh, I'm supposed to wait for the microphone. I'm sorry. This is just much smaller and closer to the ground. It seems like the work of Holly Grimm would be a point of connection between the two of you, and I wondered if maybe you could just talk about how it looks from each of your perspective, like what the intersections are between the projects.
Yeah, definitely. So Holly Grimm is the leader of Natives in Tech, and she does a lot of blockchain development. She does a lot with carbon credits, creating a planetary ledger. She does really amazing AI-generated art. She's also part of the Abundant Intelligence Working Group, which is the collective of a lot of indigenous AI researchers. And she is also Diné and Navajo, so I think that might be the connection there. But just really trying to make sure that she gets centered in a lot of these histories because of her amazing work and a lot of her place-based knowledges that she's really generous in sharing with the broader Indigenous AI community.
Yeah, no, I've never heard that name before, so I'll definitely have to do my research. But yeah, no, I'm definitely interested in how Diné people interact with AI. I've heard both sides, that it could be useful. The other half is it could lead into like appropriation of our imagery, which is something the tribe has had to deal with. And so, I will admit I've used AI to make some memes, but so that's kind of where it is. So I have to follow their work and see what they've done. But it sounds very interesting.
There are other questions? Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk and the conversation. So my question is based on my experience. I was early this year, I was at one workshop organized by Indigenous Computational Futures at Arizona State University, and the following week at ISA. So one is based entirely on technology, and the other one is more, let's say, humanities, social sciences related. And one thing that I noticed was shifting between of course, the first one workshop and the second one conferences. I realized that both are indigenous events. In technology-oriented workshop, of course, almost everything was centered around technology, and I moved on to the social science, humanities-oriented, and the conversation was around healing. And I realized that in technology spaces, healing was missing. And the following week, right, I was like, oh, that's very interesting. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on, how you see technology infrastructure in relation to healing, if that makes sense, yeah.
There's many different examples. I mean, that's the thing, those technology good, technology bad dichotomies, all of that stuff, right? It depends on how you're using it, who created so many different circumstances. There's certainly been a lot of research, for example, in health AI and how AI can assist in healing or can be good medicine or can be bad medicine. But I think it just depends on who kind of builds it and what the purpose is for. I haven't gotten into that research area that much, but I definitely think it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think when I hear people talk about detoxing from social media or detoxing from their phone, they are talking about that kind of technology anyway as something which stands in the way of healing and that people need to be healed from. So yet again, there's some way in which the stereotype of Indianness or the primitive seems to offer an alternative to that, but it really relies upon a kind of stereotyping about what Indians are and what they actually do with their time, as if people were always doing spiritual activities and never looking at their own phones or doing, seen as modern or even kind of postmodern kinds of things with the technology.
I think that a lot of people just have different relationships to technology. So to go back to your code talking example, which was Diné, but also Apache and many other nations, when people would use cryptography and private key, public key to do these things, they would also honor like a chant in order to respect the code itself. So I think there's just a different relationship to technology that brings about a certain type of healing versus this kind of like way of looking at technology as a servant of human flourishing. And that makes all the difference.
I skipped a question. So do you mind if I ask it? I realized just looking at it here that I didn't read this one. So as I mentioned before, the story of the Navajo code talkers is little known until the movie with Nicolas Cage in it, surprisingly. He did a lot to make this more known, but it since has appeared in the Smithsonian and other government websites. But like the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, the black pilots, who were also little known, a lot of that information was scrubbed from government websites under the current administration, which is taking down all information relating to what they're calling DEI, that is to say, the achievements of women or people of color. After the reference to the code talkers was taken down, the NCAI protested its removal, and it was actually put back up. And the same thing happened of the Tuskegee Airmen, an organization that works with black historians said, look, this happened. You can't just remove it because you want to. So I'm wondering, are there other stories about indigenous labor and technology that have also been erased? And what do you think happens or is at stake when we suppress or forget those stories?
Yeah, I was thinking, this is a very personal one that I kind of came about. My grandfather was a high scaler for the Glen Canyon Dam, which I didn't know about. And so if I'd known, I would have like interviewed him for like our own personal oral history for our family. But I think that kind of reminded me just in general of like things I'd like to read about, which is just native labor in the construction of infrastructure. I know, I think there's been some work done about some Mohawk who built the skyscrapers, metal ironworkers. I thought that was really intriguing. And for me, I think that was something I didn't know we had a connection to. He would just reference it here and there with interesting facts that weren't common knowledge, but I guess it makes sense because he worked on the dam. And then also just working with the Conservation Corps, the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. I'd be really interested in hearing how these Navajo workers understood their relationship to nature and what they were doing and how they understood the work they were doing, to see if it's the same way the federal government and their workers were interpreting the work they were doing, which is quote unquote saving the soil, conserving the soil at the expense of Navajo subsistent livestock. So if they had known or how they interpret that, I think would be very interesting, because I think what's captured is a lot of resistance to livestock, but not necessarily the Navajos who are involved with like actually doing the research. But yeah, again, even dams, I'd be very interested to hear how Navajo workers who worked at the dam, how they interpreted what they were doing. Because I think if there's anything I've learned in doing research is that Navajo Native people aren't monolithic in their understanding of certain things. And so trying to capture all of that would be very interesting. And so that's what I would say about that.
Can you say what a high scaler is?
It's the folks that like go on the ropes on the side of the cliff and they like drill holes. So like the pictures of him and there's a drill and he's like really high suspended up and he's just like drilling. I mean, he's smiling and having a good time, but it's very dangerous. And I think sometimes they put like dynamite in there just to get rid of some faces of the rock. So yeah, it's pretty intense, labor-intensive work. It's also very dangerous. But yeah, I wish I asked him how he understood the work he was doing and just kind of give me an experience of that and how he got into the work. Because, I don't think we capture a lot of that. And in some of the work I've read about that dam, Native peoples are usually thought of as the people who lived there beforehand and then were like displaced, but never thought of as the people who actually worked on the dam afterwards.
There's just too many examples to bring about. I think conceptually thinking about things like polymorphism, cryptography, cyberspace as this alternative dimension and conceptions of things like Australian or Aboriginal kind of the dreaming. So conceptually really important. Traditional ecological knowledges. And I always say it's just like there's an obvious answer as to who invented advanced, ICTs. Obviously, Indigenous peoples. It's really important to just kind of pull out the texture there and also see what's happening today and how it's different. So things like art, for example, or non-fungible tokens, right? They became this thing that kind of was seen as like Beanie Babies or things that grifters and exploiters did. But Indigenous artists and creators, for example, made it totally different by being able to present their work in a stage that wasn't just the sanitized spaces of galleries, for example, and were able to showcase Indigenous cultures in new ways that kind of had new dimensions and new alternative possibilities. So it's just exciting to see contributions, but also kind of subversions to systems that exist to make it their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there any more questions from either the audience or Zoom?
There is
okay.
another question from the Zoom, if we want to
Okay.
take this one. Let me just read that real quick. Did you have to do a conflict of interest statement going into your research to get past the IRB? How do you take the notion that your investigation may be biased? Is there a need for more Native researchers on this topic?
For the Navajo Nation, I don't think I took, no, I didn't sign anything about a conflict of interest. But, it's like any typical IRB. You provide everything you can with what they require, like questions, a proposal, a list of risk or anything like that. Again, my research, not a lot of health risk, but I did, mention that there might be some trauma that might emerge from these conversations that we had. So there's kind of like an emotional harm. And I mentioned that I'd, have some compensation. So, but yeah, no conflict of interest paper I had to sign.
I think the bias comment is kind of interesting because it's like objectivity isn't real, right? It's like this fake thing that Western society says in order to manage the histories of other people's, right? So I would hope to God that my research is biased. And conflict of interest, I mean, that is my interest, right? I've never been asked, but it is interesting for things like I'm starting an LLC, and interestingly, my university wants to know what I'm up to, probably for monetary reasons, right? But never for an IRB have I had to do a conflict of interest. I think you just need to be upfront about what you're doing, where you come from, and then typically you get through with an exemption.
Yeah, there's another question.
Sorry, I'll try to be quick. I just was wondering about, like, when you talked about make data sacred again, like, what does that look like? And, like, how would you apply that? And also, like, what kind of data are we talking about, or is it like more abstractly?
I guess that was a bit more abstract. I just think that people don't care about their data anymore. We just go about using our phones, giving away our most sacred, intimate images, texts, all of these things for corporations to profit off of. And all of those things are very sacred. And everything and anything can become data within a capitalist society. So all of a sudden, all of these water, mountains, all of these things are becoming data points. Like, we need to see things as less atomized and abstract and more sacred in order to build more reciprocal relationships. So I think that that's kind of what I mean there. And I think it changes depending on the context. So I'm on an NIH grant with health. And for example, that is very sacred information. And so for me, even if it's de-identified, which it becomes, and then it is no longer protected, the idea of it being used for something could still be harmful to me, even if it's de-identified. That's still sacred to me in many ways. So I think there needs to be a lot more levels of texture in how we're seeing certain types of data, and I think we need to protect it a lot more than we are, because even things like AI is existentially dependent upon harvesting so much data that it's really, it's quite concerning.
Yeah, I can throw in something there by virtue of being extremely old. So in the 80s, I remember having a Mac SE, a Mac Classic that was all one piece, and you had to put your work on a disk because that computer didn't have any memory in it, or storage. It had memory, RAM, but it didn't have any actual storage. You had to buy a floppy disk or an external disk. And so you really thought hard when you made a file. Do I really need this file? Right? Do I need this picture to be 1,000 pixels, or can it be less than that? Or if I add something, can I delete something? So personally, in my Google Drive, I've never thrown away anything. And I know this is problematic because something somewhere is having to consume water, energy, and maybe human labor to keep that thing around, but it's something I literally never think about. And so that heedlessness or thoughtlessness about our data practices is partly about the nature of the data, right? It is ours, and it sometimes is personal and sometimes culturally significant. But thinking about this notion of it as infinite, right, as not a resource we have to think about at all, has just never been a good idea in any realm. And it's maybe because we don't see the back end, like people don't see the high scaler when they turn on the light, right? They just turn it on. They don't think that anybody ever had to do anything or sacrifice to make that possible. So I'm not saying we all need to go back to using floppy disks and never looking at video. But thinking about what we are doing in our data practices as having an impact might not be a bad thing, I think. Anybody else wanted to talk?
I do have one last Zoom question.
Okay.
Which is, in the digital world, we have a split between open source and proprietary IP. But I have noticed that indigenous traditions like traditional medicine, access is layered. Experts in an inner circle, apprentices around that, clients outside of that, and even trading herbs and things outside of the community. Do you think there are applications of layered access in the digital world? Are there ways to go beyond the open/closed binary?
I mean, there's definitely different systems that exist, and all tribes have a different way of storing data. There's also different programs. Merca2 was a very popular one. There's password-protected systems. So this is something that Indigenous data sovereignty scholars and practitioners are really putting a lot of attention to in order to be sure that certain things can happen. Like tribes have big diasporic communities where tribal members can live all across the country, right? How do you have certain information accessible to them while also having different layers of protection, while also using older, potentially hardware? So how that sharing is happening is getting a lot of conversation within the Indigenous data sovereignty world.
I could just offer an appreciation.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's supposed to go on the recording, right? I just wanted to say, I didn't quite have the courage to say this when you said, why are you here? I just think I always have difficulty climbing up and down the scale of abstraction, right? But to talk about the importance of place-based work and to talk about the perspective of identifying Indigenous people with the past, not the present, not the future, to really say that this linear time of modernity that is so much the framework of everyday thought, I think for most people at this university is just really important. And I find the work that you're doing and the perspective that you offered incredibly important, and yet not wholly abstract. Do you know what I mean? Like you don't say it only at the incredible level of time. You think about time wrongly, but really bringing it up from grounded research. And I really appreciate the contributions that you made today.
Thank you. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, if you have closing remarks you wanted to add.
Thank you, and it was great to be in conversation with the two of you as well. So haimasi.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback and all the questions that y'all had. It definitely helped me rethink, again, the way I'm approaching things, but also taking into consideration the comments and the questions. So, and also what you've brought to the table. So thanks.
Yes, appreciation to everybody who came, and have a great rest of the evening.